Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're heading back to ancient India.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah, 322 BCE. The birth of the Maurya Empire. This wasn't just any empire, though. It was one of India's first major unifying forces, and it all began with a leader, a guy named Chandragupta Maurya.
And this is a big deal, right? Because unifying such a vast and diverse region, how did he pull that off?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? How
Yeah.
do you bring everyone together? Well, that's what we're diving into today. The blend of military strategy, and just straight up administrative genius, that built the Maurya Empire.
It's always fascinating to look at how empires kind of spring up, especially during times of change. So with the Maurya Empire, you've got this really interesting shift happening. You go from this nomadic life to settled agriculture.
Just huge shift.
Yeah, a really big one, right?
Yeah.
Imagine the anxieties, the hopes, all wrapped up in that transition. And all of that's reflected in those ancient Indian texts, the Vedas. That's the backdrop for Chandragupta Maurya.
So the Vedas are our window into this pivotal moment.
Exactly. And the Vedas aren't just one book. There are four of them. The Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharva Veda. Each one offers a different perspective on the world, reflecting the beliefs and practices of ancient Indian society, like different chapters in a really big story.
Okay, four Vedas, each with its own unique flavor. Can you give us a taste?
Yeah, for sure. The Rig Veda, that's the oldest one. It's full of hymns to different deities, gives you a peek into their cosmology, the rituals, how they saw the universe. Then there's the Samaveda, which is all about melody and chant, almost like a musical guide to their spiritual practices.
Interesting. So like a soundtrack.
Yeah, exactly. The Yajurveda, on the other hand, is more practical. It's like instructions for priests doing sacrifices. So religion was deeply woven into their daily life.
Makes sense.
And then you have the Atharva Veda. This one's all about the mystical side, spells, incantations. It's getting into the very nature of reality.
It's amazing how these ancient texts can still speak to us, across all these centuries. But you mentioned the Vedas weren't just historical records. They've continued to shape Indian thought and culture.
Oh, absolutely. The impact of the Vedas is huge. You see it in Indian philosophy, religion, art, everything from yoga practices to classical Indian music shows how these ancient ideas still resonate today. It's like the enduring power of tradition.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so the Vedas also introduce some pretty deep concepts: Brahman, Atman, Dharma, and karma. Could you break those down for us?
Okay, so these are kind of like the cornerstones of Indian thought, right? Brahman is the ultimate reality, the source of everything. Think of it like the cosmic canvas. And then there's Atman, which is the individual self, the soul. It's like a spark of that divine whole of Brahman.
Okay, so Brahman is the whole thing, and Atman is like a tiny piece of it.
Exactly. Then you've got Dharma, which is all about cosmic order. It's duty, it's righteousness, it's living in alignment with, well, everything. And then there's karma. Karma is action and consequence. It's not just about punishment or reward. It's like this web of cause and effect.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. And these Vedic ideas had a big influence on the development of Indian society, right? Like even the caste system.
Yeah, the origins of the caste system do go back to the Vedas, but it's important to remember the Vedas describe a division of labor, not the rigid social hierarchy that came later. It probably started as a way to organize society based on skills and jobs, but then over time it became, well, more rigid.
So the Vedas are giving us this glimpse into a society that's changing, new ways of life, new ways of thinking. And that's the context for the Maurya Empire.
Right. The rise of the Maurya Empire is totally tied to those shifts happening in ancient India.
And at the center of it all, you have Chandragupta Maurya. What made him such a remarkable leader?
Well, Chandragupta Maurya, he was a visionary, a strategist, a master of statecraft. He saw how power was shifting, and he was able to unify this huge, diverse region. A mix of military power and administrative savvy. It's the story of ambition, determination, and understanding the political landscape.
So not just a warrior king, but a sharp administrator too.
Exactly. Chandragupta knew that military victories were just the first step. To really unify an empire, you need a strong system. He created the centralized bureaucracy, standardized laws and taxes, and get this, he built a network of roads and infrastructure that connected the whole empire.
Wow. So he was laying the groundwork for a stable society.
Absolutely. That's what ensures an empire lasts.
This is fascinating. Are there any parallels, do you think, between his strategies and those of later Indian empires, the Mughals, for example?
Yeah. You're right. There are some striking similarities between how the Mauryas and the Mughals tackled the challenge of ruling a diverse empire. Both rose from periods of change, upheaval, and both relied on military strength to conquer and establish their rule. And importantly, both understood you need a strong central administration to keep things running.
So it's like the Maurya set a precedent, a blueprint that echoed for centuries.
It's possible the Mughals, they were really interested in the statecraft of their predecessors, including the Mauryas. They studied those old texts, on governance and military strategy. So yeah, the Maurya Empire definitely cast a long shadow over Indian history.
Interesting. So this idea of learning from the past, using that ancient wisdom, it seems like a key element in their success. And that this concept you mentioned earlier, the ancient constitution, does that tie into this? Seeking legitimacy from the past.
Yeah, the idea of an ancient constitution, it's really central to understanding how rulers all throughout history legitimize their power,
Yeah.
Even in India, it's like this idea that there's some set of timeless principles, right? A blueprint for how you govern that goes beyond any specific ruler or dynasty.
So like they're saying, hey, we're not just making this stuff up, we're following the ancients.
Right. And it's powerful, By rooting their rule in tradition, rulers, they can boost their legitimacy, create a sense of continuity, stability. It's like saying, we're not just conquerors, we're the rightful heirs to this long and glorious past.
That ancient constitution idea, though, it seems a bit, I don't know, slippery. Like, who gets to decide what counts as ancient, what those principles even are? It seems like it could be easily twisted, to benefit whoever's in power at the time.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely open to interpretation. It can be used however it suits those in charge. What one person sees as this timeless principle, another might say it's totally outdated. Powerful tool, sure, but it can be used to justify all sorts of things.
Okay, so how did this ancient constitution thing play out with the Maurya Empire? Did Chandragupta Maurya use it?
Well, they might not have used the exact term ancient constitution back then, but the concept, yeah, it was definitely there. Chandragupta's role, it was very much shaped by existing traditions, beliefs, like those found in the Vedas. He wanted a system of governance that was both effective and lined up with those principles of Dharma, that cosmic order we talked about.
So a balance between being innovative and keeping with tradition, using the past to build a strong empire for the future.
Exactly. And it's that mix, the pragmatism and the idealism that makes Chandragupta Maurya so interesting. He was a sharp politician, a skilled military leader, but he also genuinely seemed to want a just and ethical society.
He understood that real power isn't just about military strength, right? It's about inspiring people, uniting them under a shared vision.
Yeah, for sure. And that idea of a ruler's moral duty, governing in line with Dharma, that would stick around in Indian political thought for a long, long time.
So as we move forward in time, we see this ancient constitution idea pop up again, right? With the Mughals.
Right. The Mughals, they ruled India from the 16th to the 19th century, and they were also interested in this whole ancient constitution concept. They knew about India's history, and they wanted to be seen as the inheritors of this long tradition of imperial rule.
But the Mughals weren't originally from India, were they? They came from Central Asia, conquerors. So how do they connect that with claiming to uphold an ancient Indian tradition?
It's complicated, but the Mughals, they were really good at adapting culturally. They took on aspects of Indian culture, language, art, architecture. They also tried to link their rule back to earlier Indian dynasties, presenting themselves as the successors to this long line of emperors.
So it's strategic, a way to make their rule seem more legitimate, solidify their power.
Spot on. And it worked really well, too. The Mughals created one of the most powerful and long-lasting empires in Indian history. They left a huge mark on Indian culture and society.
It's incredible how this one concept, the ancient constitution, can jump across cultures or historical periods. It's a reminder that power isn't just about military might. It's also about storytelling, crafting narratives that people will believe in and accept your authority.
Totally. The ability to connect with the past, to tell a good story that links the present to this glorious history, it's always been a powerful tool for those in charge. And this brings us to another fascinating chapter, the arrival of the British East India Company on the Indian subcontinent.
Things are about to get interesting. We've got a trading company, not your typical empire, stepping in and eventually taking control over huge parts of India. Where do they fit in with this whole ancient constitution thing?
Well, at the start, the British East India Company, they were focused on trade, spices, textiles, all that good stuff. But as they got more powerful, they became more and more involved in Indian politics. And that's where the ancient constitution makes a comeback.
So did the British just copy what the Mughals did? saying they were upholding some ancient Indian tradition to justify their rule?
It wasn't quite that straightforward. While the British were definitely influenced by how the Mughals governed, they also had their own ideas about power and legitimacy. Remember, they had their own version of an ancient constitution back in England, one that emphasized the rule of law, parliamentary power, and the rights of their subjects.
So you've got this clash of constitutional visions going on during colonial conquest. What could go wrong, right?
It was definitely a recipe for conflict.
Yeah.
The British were trying to reconcile their own beliefs about how to govern with the reality of ruling this huge and diverse empire halfway across the world.
So how did they manage that? Did they force their own version of the ancient constitution on India? Or did they try to adapt to the systems that were already there?
It was this back and forth between imposing their will and adapting. On one hand, the British, they were driven by their own goals. They weren't afraid to change Indian institutions to fit their needs, but they also saw the value in understanding and working within the existing power structures.
A delicate balancing act, trying to pursue their own goals while still appearing legitimate to the Indian people.
Exactly. And you see this tension play out, especially in their interactions with the Indian elites who had been serving the Mughal Empire.
So how did those Indian elites react to the British takeover? Did they just accept it, or did they resist?
It was a mixed bag, really. Some elites went along with the British, hoping to keep their status under the new regime. Others resisted, some openly rebelled, others used more subtle tactics. It was a time of huge uncertainty, the old order collapsing, a new one emerging.
Yeah, what a time of upheaval, everyone scrambling to figure out their place.
Yeah.
But as the British East India Company's grip tightened, they had a big question, didn't they? How do you actually rule this massive, diverse land?
That's the puzzle that kept those British administrators busy for, well, generations. And their whole approach, it was tied to this idea of the ancient constitution, that search for a way to govern, to bridge the gap between what they believed and the realities of India.
Okay, so how did that actually work? What did the British do to shape India according to their vision?
One big focus, education. They set up English language schools, pushed European literature, philosophy, science. The thinking was that Western education, that's the key to, uplifting Indian society, bringing it in line with their ideas of progress, enlightenment, all that.
So they wanted to create a generation of Indians who thought more like Englishmen.
There was definitely an element of that, of cultural assimilation. But it's important to remember not all British officials saw it as just forcing their culture on others. Some truly believed they were sharing knowledge, helping India advance. Of course, there was a big dose of, well, paternalism in there,
Yeah.
assuming they knew what was best for India.
It's tricky, isn't it? Trying to bring progress while also denying people their agency, imposing your values, seems like that would cause friction.
Yeah, it did. You see that tension playing out in lots of areas, especially their attempts at social reform. The British, they were horrified by some Indian practices like soti, that's the ritual burning of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. They saw it as barbaric and bandit, along with other practices they felt were, well, uncivilized.
So another clash of British values versus Indian traditions. Did the British even try to understand the cultural context of these practices before just outlawing them?
There were some, certainly, who tried to engage with Indian culture, understand why things were done a certain way. But generally, there was this feeling of moral superiority, like British values were just better. So it was a top-down approach to reform, and, well, it didn't always go as planned, sometimes even causing harm.
Good intentions don't always equal good results, especially when you're dealing with different cultures. But as the East India Company's power grew, did they ever move past this ancient constitution idea? Did their vision for India change?
That's an important point. As their ambitions expanded, they did start to shift away from just restoring some, idealized past. They began to embrace this new narrative, one where they were the modernizers, the reformers.
So instead of looking back to the past for legitimacy, they were looking ahead, bringing progress and enlightenment to India.
Exactly. And that change in thinking, it had a huge impact. It led to these sweeping changes. Infrastructure, law, administration, they built railroads, put in new legal codes, created a more centralized bureaucracy. The goal, to transform India into a modern, efficient, and of course, British-controlled colony.
It's amazing how this one concept, this ancient constitution, played such a big role in the early days of British colonialism. It was how they justified their rule, how they framed their actions, even as their vision for India evolved.
It shows how tradition and innovation are always interacting. that push and pull between preserving the past and shaping the future. And it reminds us that even empires, with all their power, still need to make their actions seem right, legitimate, even if they have to use myths and wishful thinking to do it.
We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the ancient Vedas to the Maurya Empire, the Mughal era, and then the arrival of the British East India Company. It's a story full of ambition, innovation, and that constant human search for meaning, for legitimacy in the echoes of the past.
And as we finish this deep dive, I think it's crucial to remember that the past is never really gone. It shapes us, whether we realize it or not. So, as you keep exploring history, keep those critical questions in mind. Questions about power, legitimacy, and how the past still influences us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the emergence of the Maurya Empire and how ancient traditions and colonial ambitions collided. Until next time, keep exploring.